graders, welcome back to another The Math Show with Miss Condry. Hooray! Don't forget, we do have some norms. Remember that this is a learning environment, even though you're not in the school setting. So don't forget to have a positive attitude, be respectful. I'm going to remind you that every single week because it's so important. Keep trying even when it's hard. Today I'm going to teach you something brand new that you've never learned. It's going to pull together a bunch of things we learned this year in math, but you have not done any problems like this before. So I'm excited to work with you on it. And it might be really hard at first, but we'll work through it together and you'll just keep on trying. And remember that if you're not good at it, you're just not good at it yet. You will be after you practice. Okay, so we are going to be working, this is the only video I'm going to put out this week because the first part of this packet, the purple one that I sent home, which is Unit 6, Module 4, the first page of it is review of volume, and if you're stuck on that, then you need to watch last week's videos. But everything else, the bottom of that page and then the other page, is about using an array with mixed numbers. So today, our learning target for this packet is that I can use an array or an area model to multiply mixed numbers. Okay, there is a lot that goes into knowing how to do this. And I want to spend some time reviewing because you may be asking your parents for help, and this might be helpful for them to see as well because they didn't learn how to multiply mixed numbers in this way. So I want to review a few things that you guys know or might just need to be reminded of. Okay, the first thing is, what is an array? Okay, you've been working with these probably since second grade actually. And an array is made up of columns and rows, and we know that every column and row has the same number in them. We see arrays all the time in real life. An egg carton is an example of a 2x6 array. We use those as a model for multiplication. So we can see that there are 3 rows and there are 4 columns in this array. And we can either count how many squares are made up in the array, or what we can do is we could skip count 3, 6, 9, 12, or 4, 8, 12, or we can use what we know about multiplication to do 3 times 4 is 12. And then we know the inside. Okay, so we're figuring out the area or the inside space that this array makes. Okay, so then that leads us to what is an area model. An area model is what we start using when we don't want to draw all the different sections inside an array. I always think about this like if I wanted to figure out the area of my bedroom or of my classroom or of my yard, the inside space of a two-dimensional object here. And we could just know, because this is like an array, even though we can't see all the individual squares, if we want to find the area, we could do 25 times 12, okay? And if we had a calculator handy, we could use that. Or we could also, if we don't have that handy and we want to learn about multiplication, which is what we're doing right now, we could also break this apart and just find portions at a time, which is kind of nice. So like, for instance, I could find the area of part of my array, that would be easy, and then find the area of the other portion, and then add those together. So let's pretend this is only 10 feet and this is 2 feet. And I can find the area of this section up here now because it would be like the part of the room that is 25 by 10. And 25 by 10 is easy for me, equals 250. So basically I'm just breaking it into chunks to make it simpler. And we can break it into as many chunks as we want, as long as we can multiply those parts quickly and efficiently. And then we can do 2 times 25 here, because this area here would have the dimensions 25 by 2, and that's 50. So then I can put those two together to get 300, and that's the inside part of my array. So that was kind of a crash course in what an area model is, and we've used that a lot with whole numbers, and it actually, this is a model that we also get to use later when you guys are in middle school and high school with algebra. And that's kind of cool that you can use a model that you learned in elementary school to do algebra. Okay, couple more review things before I actually teach you how to multiply mixed numbers. You have some things to know and remember. We have worked on these all year long. That doesn't mean they're easy for everybody. They still can be challenging. So I just want to remind you of some things. The first one, you all know how to do. Multiplying whole numbers like 4 times 5. We can multiply whole numbers pretty easily in our heads. We don't even need to draw an array anymore. 4 times 5, piece of cake, 20. We also need to know how to multiply whole numbers times a fraction. This is something you learned last year in 4th grade, and we built upon it this year. So we could think about something like 3 times 1/2 as 3 groups of 1/2. So like 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2. And that would equal 3 halves or 1 1/2. Both are accurate. Okay. We also learned this year that we could think about it as 1/2 of 3. So we could find half of 3. And half of 3 is 1 1/2, which is the same answer we got over here. So 2 different ways of thinking about that. I'm going to turn my volume down here. Okay. The next thing that we've learned this year, this is brand new this year. You did not do this last year in 4th grade. And we spent some time on it after winter break, and that is multiplying fractions times a fraction. This is where we got out those geoboards, if you remember, and we divided up a 1 by 1 area or square. So if we thought about that as 1 by 1, we could go over, we can make the dimensions 1/2. So right there is 1/2 by 1/4. So that means this section needs to go down 1/4. So we're going to go down 1/4 and over 1/2. And that little section there, that area, is 1/8 of the whole thing. So 1/2 times 1/4 equals 1/8. Something important that will help you save time that you noticed when we did lots of these is you can check your work or even solve it by multiplying the numerators together and the denominators together. And that might be a shortcut you want to use when we're doing this next thing. So 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 4 is 8. That only works when we're multiplying 2 fractions together. Okay, that was a crash course. We just talked about an area model. We just talked about remembering how to multiply whole numbers, simple whole numbers, fractions times a whole number, and fraction times fraction. And today's lesson pulls all of those things that you've been studying since 3rd grade and learning about with arrays and multiplication and what that means, and everything we've done this year in 5th grade with fractions, and it puts it all together, and we're going to do that. There's a lot of steps, but this week's packet walks you through it pretty nicely. So we're going to practice just an example problem together. We're going to give it a try. So I'm going to picture something that is an area that has dimensions of 3 1/4 by 2 1/2. Okay? So the first thing I want you to be able to do is to draw an array or an area model with these dimensions. So I want there to be, you can think about it like going over 3 feet and then 1/4 of a foot, and then down 2 feet and another 1/2 of a foot, or inches, or whatever it is, whatever you're thinking of finding the area of. Okay, so I'm going to give that a start. I'm going to go over what looks like 3 1/4. I don't know. I'm just kind of guessing, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I want to break this apart into a 3 and a 1/4. Okay? So I'm going to consider this line 3, and then I'm going to go over just a 1/4 amount more. I separated them just so that you can see that easily. Like if I put those 2 lines together, I would make 3 and 1/4. So I have that dimension. And then I'm going to also break apart this 2.5 into a 2 and a 1/2. Okay, so I'm going to go down about 2. It shouldn't be longer than the 3. And then 1/2. And 1/2 is a little bit more than a 1/4. In fact, it's double 1/4, so I'll call that 1/2. Okay, and now I can make a rectangle. And my job with this rectangle, it's a little crooked here. It's hard to draw in front of a screen. Okay, so this rectangle has the dimensions 2.5 by 3 1/4. And if I multiply those dimensions together, that's going to give me the area, the inside amount. The problem is I don't know how to multiply a mixed number times a mixed number, so I would rather break it into parts that I do know how to do and find different areas of this rectangle and then put them together. So I'm going to break it apart, and I'm going to find these 2 areas. And actually, I'm going to find 4 different areas. Okay, I'm going to find the area of this section, this section, this section, and this section. I'm going to start with the biggest section. You can start in any order, it doesn't really matter. This area has the dimensions 3 by 2. So we can figure out the area by doing 3 times 2, which equals 6. Okay, so far, so good. Nice and easy, right? Okay, next we're going to move on to another section. I'm just going to go straight across to this one. This section, this part right here has an area or the dimensions 1/4 by, and this line here is the same length as this line over here. So it's by 2. So the area of this section is 2 by 1/4. And I can think about that as 2 groups of 1/4, like 1/4 plus 1/4, which is 2/4. Or 1/2, whatever you prefer to think of it as. Okay, the area of this section here, this one has dimensions 1/2 and it goes over 3. So the dimensions are 3 by 1/2. So the area of this section is 1/2 by 3. And again, I can think about this as 3 groups of 1/2, or like in my example earlier, half of 3. So I'm going to think about it as 3 groups of 1/2 because I think a lot of you are still doing that, and that's great. So 1/2 plus 1/2 is a whole, plus another half is 1.5. So that equals 1.5. Okay, next is this tiny little section here. And this has dimensions 1/4 by 1/2. So I could think about this as 1/4 of a half or 1/2 of a 1/4. I could also remember that I can multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators here. I don't really want you drawing a separate array for this. We spent enough time in class doing that, and it's okay for you to use that little shortcut now. So 1/2 by 1/4 is 1, because 1 times 1 is 1. 4 times 2 is 8, and I can check that because I know half of a 1/4 is also 1/8. Okay, so now you have found all the different products or areas of each of these sections. So to figure out the area of this entire thing, we need to put them all together, which means we need to add this area, 6, plus this area, 2/4. I'm going to call that 1/2, okay? Because I know that it's 1/2, plus this area, which is 1.5, and that's kind of nice because those are already halves, plus 1/8. Okay, so let's see here. I'm going to add the half plus the 1.5 first, and that's going to make 2. And then I can add that with the 6, so that's 8. And then I have this little extra 1/8 here. So it's 8 and 1/8. So the area, or the answer to my original expression up here, is 8 and 1/8. Okay. As you work through some of these problems, you may end up with a bottom equation where you're adding those different parts of the areas together. And some of those denominators might be different, and you might have to change them into fractions with common denominators. So like I said, this is pulling together everything we've done this year, adding fractions, multiplying fractions, area models, everything. So I would anticipate that some of this is kind of challenging. We will go over more examples next week during our teams meetings. Until then, practice, 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 and see what parts you feel really good about and then which parts you still need help with. All right, good luck, everyone.